Well, you're not the newest kid on the block for very long in the four-wheel drive ute world. The Ford Ranger hasn't been out for that long, but this Volkswagen Amarok is now the latest one getting around. Now, you probably already know this, but the Volkswagen Amarok and Ford Ranger share the same Ford-derived platform. It's called T6.3, and it was designed and engineered mostly in Australia. So that means this Amarok has more of an Australian flavour than ever before. That is pretty cool. Now, there's one thing to point out here. If you look at, say, the Mazda BT50 and the Isuzu D-Max, they are almost identical in many respects. The Amarok and Ranger, it's a little bit of a different story. Volkswagen was involved from day dot with the development of this car, and they actually had 20 engineers based in Australia in Ford facilities for around 3.5 years during the development of this car. So I'm hoping that this thing is going to feel a little bit different to the Ranger, which is a very good ute, by the way. But I'm hoping that this one carries its own flavor in terms of the way it drives, the way it feels, the inside, and all of those sorts of things. And in this video, I want to run you through all of that stuff. We're going to see how it drives. We're going to try out a couple of different powertrains. We're going to do a little bit of off-roading as well. And we're going to dig through the interior in terms of the space, the comfort, the practicality, and of course, the infotainment and technology. So there is a fair bit to get through with this video. Let's get stuck into it.
This new Volkswagen Amarok will come in 5 different specification levels. Base level Amarok replaces the old Core, while new specs, life and style effectively replace the old Sportline and Highline grades. At the top will be Americana and Aventura, which act like a two-pronged approach to the top specification. Americana has a slight leaning towards off-road driving with 18-inch alloy wheels and all-terrain tyres, while the Aventura, with 21-inch wheels and highway terrain tyres, focuses more on urban usage, and it's also got a sportier suspension and steering tune.
Now, the next thing to talk about here is powertrains. This model behind me here, and what we've been driving mostly in this launch review is a 3-litre V6. Now, you'll know about it because it's a Ford engine and it's matched up to a 10-speed automatic gearbox, and in this case a permanent all-wheel drive system. It's all going to sound very familiar because it's the same as the Ford Ranger, but this one has been tuned by Volkswagen engineers. So once again, I'm hoping that it's going to feel a little bit different overall. There's also a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel engine that can be had as a single turbo or a bi-turbo model, and once again, that's all very familiar because the Ford Ranger has all those things. But there are some things that the Ranger doesn't have. A 6-speed manual gearbox option in the base specification model. That's going to be pretty cool to drive, and also there is going to be a 2.3-litre turbocharged petrol engine available in this top spec model as an option. I'm really keen to see what that's like. However, unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity now to test one out, so that'll be down the track at some stage.
The 2023 Amarok is set to arrive in Australia in April 2023, initially coming in style, Americana and Aventura grades. Lower spec Amarok and Life will arrive later by the middle of the year. We don't currently know pricing for this new Amarok, but we do understand that prices will rise in comparison to the previous generation. We are expecting approximately for the range to start at around $55,000 for a base specification 4-wheel drive dual cab model, while the top spec models will likely go for over $80,000, and that's both before on-road costs. Along with a platform that is shared with the Ford Ranger, this new Amarok uses Ford-derived powertrains. It starts with a 2-litre single-turbo 4-cylinder diesel engine, which makes 125 kilowatts and 405 newton meters. And this runs through either a 6-speed manual or automatic transmission and part-time 4-wheel drive system. The next step up is a twin turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, which makes 154 kilowatts and 500 newton meters, and that runs through a 10-speed automatic gearbox. Style is the first grade to get the option of a 3-litre diesel V6, and this makes 184 kilowatts and 600 newton meters, along with a permanent 4-wheel drive system. Top spec Aventura is the only model in the range to get an optional 2.3-litre turbocharged petrol engine. You don't get this in the Ford Ranger in Australia, and it makes 222 kilowatts and 452 newton meters.
Here's the interior of the new Amarok, and this is top specification I'm sitting in at the moment, Aventura. There is also the Americana, which is very similar overall, but there are a few different materials and treatments getting around the place. But I'll start with some elements, I suppose. We've got to talk about the Ford Ranger relationship here in terms of what is carrying over. One of them, that's pretty obvious to see there, that is the same shifter as a Ford Ranger. but a lot of things are different. The infotainment, we've got a 12.3-inch infotainment display here. That's the same hardware as the Ranger, but it is a different experience to use. The software is different. We've got a different lineup of buttons here as well. You don't get those climate control buttons, which I'm sure some people would miss out of a Ranger, but this is a bit of a different setup here. Instead, you've got one button to go in there, and then you can adjust the climate control things through the infotainment display. I'm a big lover of buttons, but I do have to say this isn't too bad to use. You simply press one button and most of the controls there, they're relatively easy to use even when you're on the move. So that's not too bad. And overall, this infotainment display, it's modern, it's new, it's quite sleek. I like the wireless Apple CarPlay. I like the wireless Android Auto as well. There's native navigation there and digital radio, but I do have to say the system does feel slightly laggy sometimes when you're going through the buttons and you're waiting for it to respond. It's not all the time, but sometimes maybe you catch the system when it's napping or busy doing other things, and it just takes a little time for it to load. But otherwise, I do like the system, and it's important that it's different from the Ranger because this is such an important touch point. It's an interface that you have with the car, and this does feel more like a Volkswagen. So do the buttons here. It's all pretty good in that regard. In terms of power outlets, we've got a 12-volt one there. There's a USB and a USB-C. We've got a wireless charging pad there to chuck your phone down. And of course, there is also one up there. There's a USB point there, which is really handy if you're going to run a dash cam or maybe a navigator or something like that all the time. I do like to see that one there. We've got a sunglasses holder there. You can option a switch panel a la Ford Ranger Raptor, obviously, here for your auxiliary stuff. But in terms of other storage points, we've got a normal glove box here and then another one that's kind of hidden somewhat there on the top. It's quite a nice feel, that's not too bad. And there's actually a fair bit of storage space in there for a few extra bits and bobs, but you do miss out on the cup holders, those slide out cup holders below the air vents there that the Ford Ranger gets in Wildtrak and Raptor specification. The steering wheel here is unique to the Amarok, and it's nice. It's got a nice finish. The buttons work well. There's no issues there. And you've got a big digital instrument cluster here in this specification. That's a 12.3-inch cluster up there. Lower specification grades get the smaller 8-inch one, but this is nice. And just like the infotainment display, this is a different experience to use. Regardless of it being the same hardware, the software and the user experience is different enough, I think, to justify this being a Volkswagen and not just another Ford. Now, in terms of ergonomics here, these seats are great. I do like these seats quite a bit. They're a little bit more bolstered than a Ford Ranger seat and more bolstered actually than most other dual cab utes on the market. Ergonomically, this feels great. You've got tilt and reach adjustment through the steering wheel, a lot of electric adjustment as well, which is nice, and I do like the adjustable thigh support that you get in here. So we've been driving these cars for 2-hour stints and I've been very comfortable, no issues there whatsoever. Before I hop into the second row here and show you the space and the comfort on offer, I'll just pop this up here. You do have some nice storage underneath the back seat here, which is cool. This side is mostly taken up by your vehicle jack. This one has a warning triangle and your tire change tools there. It's good to see that, nice and easy to get to if you do get a flat. This thing does have 21-inch wheels, so maybe if you take this off-road all the time, you might be using this more often than not. But on the other side there, you've got some pretty handy storage and you can fit a fair bit in there. Just like the Ford Ranger, I really like to see this scalloped bottom out of the seat here. You can actually fit a lot in there in terms of recovery gear, a first aid kit, something like that that's easy to get to when you need it, but out of sight for the rest of the time. But let's hop in. So that's my driving position up in front there. Let me just pop that up. This has the same wheelbase as a Ford Ranger, and this is one of the larger vehicles in the segment overall, and that yields pretty good interior space for a dual cab ute. So with my driving position there, I've got a fair amount of legroom on offer still, and if I tuck them in there, I've got a little bit more scalloping. Good tow room as well, and I do like the amount of slant going on with this seat base here. For a dual cab ute, this is never going to be as comfortable as something like a large SUV. Even some of the bigger medium-sized SUVs will have more space and comfort on offer than this, but for the segment, this is quite solid. We've got air vents here, that's all really good. There are no controls here for the air vents, so you kind of get what you're given, I suppose, in that regard. Although I did notice here, these air vents do feel a little bit flimsy in terms of how they're mounted. But we do have a 12-volt plug there, and a household 230 volt plug. That's something that you don't see too often in dual cab utes, so that could be really handy for powering something like a phone charger, powering up a laptop or a camera, whatever it might be. But overall, this in the second row is quite impressive. Now to the business end of this Amarok. I'll show you through what the tub is like. And this Aventura model, just like the Americana, does have a fair bit going on. Firstly, the tub does lock via the central locking. That is good to see. If you're going to be using this thing all the time, just makes it really easy to live with. Pop down that tailgate there, and that is damped, which is quite nice. Very similar to the Ford Ranger. Once again, I keep bringing that car up, but that does have a close relationship to this Amarok, so I think it is worthwhile. Now we've got a drop-in tub liner here, which is cool, and of course an electric roll cover. There is a button there on the inside, but you've also got one on the key fob. Press that twice and it opens up by itself. Really handy to use. Obviously this is not for someone who's going to be using it in a real trade application all the time. This is now a family car with an extremely large boot that opens up to the elements if you need it. Does work well, I think, and this is what a lot of people are buying these days. Some other things to point out here, we've got 6 tie down points, which is good to see. That's quite a few, especially when you've got that cassette up the front there, which does take up a little bit of space, it's worth saying. But you've also got a 12 volt plug, which is nicely protected from the elements. You've also got these load rails on each side there, so you can pop things into those rails and you can use them as an adjustable point. If you're going to be using this, you're going to use the payload when you can. You've got a lot of options here for securing your load, which I think is good. But otherwise, this is a good sized tray. We've got a lot of space going on here. You can fit a Euro pallet in the back here, just like the old Amarok. I don't think many people actually do that though, to be honest. If you're going to be putting pallets in the back of a ute, you're going to have a tray back, right? But it's still a good indication of how much space you've got on offer here. So the Amarok from the back, all well and good. Currently behind the wheel of a Americana Amarok, and I've got the 3-litre V6 diesel engine under the bonnet. Naturally, there are a lot of things in common with the Ford Ranger in this Amarok in terms of the mechanical stuff. There's a lot of familiar things in terms of how it drives as well. Power delivery is similar. Performance overall is similar. It's running through a 10-speed automatic gearbox, and we do have that trick semi-permanent automatic all-wheel drive system, which is really good to have, especially when there's 600 Newton meters available. We've also spent some time in the Aventura, which is the other high-spec model, and there is a little bit of difference between those two. Volkswagen have done a different tune overall. The suspension is a little bit stiffer overall in that Aventura model, and it's got a stiffer sway bar, 21-inch wheels, and more road-oriented tyres, so it steers quite nicely, handles really well, but it does have a little bit of jiggle, that sort of ute jiggle that you tend to get more from the back end, but that Aventura has a little bit through the front, through the steering as well, because it feels relatively tied down overall. Once you start driving through corners, there are dividends there, it steers nicely, the tyres grip well, they don't squeal. It does actually get through corners at a fair clip, considering it's a 4-wheel drive ute. But for my money, I would prefer this one. This is the Americana. It's a little bit less tied down. It's got a bit more bump absorption going on. The cars we're currently driving on this international launch, they've got 20-inch alloy wheels. The good news, what I think anyway, is that the ones from Australia coming to the Australian market will have 18-inch alloy wheels. That's better for off-roading, but it also should yield benefits for when you're wanting a little bit more ride comfort, especially when the road surface is a bit imperfect. Things like potholes, some wobbles and wibbles and that sort of thing. It'll help iron that stuff out even a little bit more. We haven't had a chance to really drive a pure Australian spec one yet, so we'll know more when we definitely drive one, but I've got good hopes for that being the pick out of the 2 top spec models so far. When you're driving this Amarok, you do get the feel that Volkswagen have really tried to make a different sort of driving experience in comparison to that Ranger. It's very different, like I said, to the Mazda BT50 Isuzu D-Max relationship. Volkswagen have touched things like suspension, the springs, the shock absorbers, the steering. This is the electromechanical steering setup that the Ranger has, but it means it's also tunable in terms of how fast it responds to steering inputs, the weighting and all sorts of things. this Amarok does steer differently to the Ranger, and it does steer quite nicely, I have to say. We've been driving a variety of roads here in South Africa. A lot of the road surfaces have actually been really good. We've had a few less than perfect roads recently today, and the ride quality for me in this Panamericana is pretty good. It's similar to the Ranger. I think this is one of the better utes to drive overall in terms of the way it steers, the ride comfort, the refinement and that sort of thing. The Ranger is a great ute. Naturally, so is this, but it does feel a little bit different, which I think is good. Most people will be interested in this 3-litre single turbo V6 that we've got here. It's over 180 kilowatts and 600 Newton meters. Now, in comparison to the old Amarok V6, the older one actually had more power. That was 190 kilowatts and 200 kilowatts on brief periods of overboost, but it couldn't match the torque. It only had 580 Newton meters. It does have a very different nature, that engine. The Volkswagen V6 feels a little bit more peaky and revvy. This one has what seems like a flatter power and torque curve overall, and it feels like a little bit more of a lugger. It's maybe not as fast outright in terms of straight line speed. I'm not 100% sure there, but this is refined, it's smooth, it's got a little bit of a whistle going on when it's under load, and performance for a 4-wheel drive ute, aside from something like a turbocharged petrol like the Ranger Raptor, this will be one of the better utes in that regard. It'll definitely leave all the 4-cylinder ones in its dust. There's an interesting point to make there as well. The entry-level diesel is a 2-litre single turbo 4-cylinder engine, and then you can step up into the bi-turbo that's got more power overall, 155 kilowatts and 500 Newton meters, and that runs through a 10-speed automatic. The base one has either 6-speed manual or 6-speed auto. If you do want 3 pedals in a ute, it's great to see that there, but I think most people will probably opt for the bi-turbo option or this V6. But the really interesting thing for me, I'm really sad we didn't get the opportunity to drive it here on this event. Volkswagen have put the option of a 2.3-litre turbocharged engine in the top spec Aventura model, and that's a bit of a step change. You don't see petrol too often in 4-wheel drive utes these days. The Ranger Raptor has brought it back, I guess, in a performance sense, but that engine is going to be really interesting to see how it goes. If it's nice and smooth and refined and well calibrated, it could be a great thing if you're wanting a really high-end experience, driving experience in your ute. Like I said, no chance of driving it this time, unfortunately, so stay tuned for that one. The first generation Amarok dates back to 2010, 2011, and by the time it was put out to pasture, it was an extremely old ute. But you do have to take your hat off to it, because although it was old, it was one of the nicest utes to drive. It had a great powertrain, obviously, that V6 diesel was really good, but the way it steered, the way it rode, it was one of the more car-like driving experiences, and one of the more well-polished ones overall, which is no mean feat. The good news here though, Ford and Volkswagen have teamed up to develop this ute. Ford has definitely led the charge, but Volkswagen have had a lot of input, and they've made a ute that does feel different to the Ranger. Not massively different, but different enough. And I think it still carries that feeling of the old one. You've got an all-wheel drive system, tick, that's really good. You've got a V6 diesel, that's nice and grunty, very powerful, tick, that's good as well. And in terms of the ride, the steering, it's all right up at the top of the class. And I think if it took a backward step in any of those regards, the Amarok would lose a little bit of that shine overall, but it hasn't. So if you're wanting a ute that has just about all the bells and whistles, you've got a fair budget to spend. I'm not sure how expensive this is yet, but I'm going to wager a bet that it's going to be fairly expensive. This is definitely worth looking at. Now, I'm not off-road at the moment, currently driving on some fairly winding roads on the coast here, but we did get the chance to put this Amarok through a bit of an off-road driving course to see what it was like. First thing to say, it wasn't overly challenging overall. We definitely weren't putting this thing right to the limit of its capability. Although there is a carryover sense to the all-wheel drive 4Motion branding of this new Amarok, it is a different setup overall. Very different in terms of the way it works, because this thing has pretty much a Ford-derived powertrain through there. It's got a system that's the same as the Ford Ranger, Ford Everest, and Ranger Raptor as well. So you've got the
the ability to run in 2-wheel drive, so that's 2 high, rear-wheel drive, just like most other 4-wheel drive utes, but there's also a 4A button there. You can turn that around. It's not a button, it's a dial, I should say. But what that does is it means the car is still in rear-wheel drive most of the time, but the computer's on board and you've got some multi-plate clutch packs there in this transfer case, and that starts to bring drive into the front whenever you need it. That means on things like slippery bitumen, wet roads, whatever it might be, dirt, anything where grip is starting to fall away a little bit, it's going to pay some big dividends. And then turn it around once more, and that goes into 4H or 4 high, and what that does is pretty much those clutch packs lock in, and then you've got effectively 50-50 split between the front and the rear wheels, and that is just like 4 high on any other 4-wheel drive ute. Don't use it on the blacktop when there's lots of grip, because you're going to bind up the powertrain. And then once again, keep turning it around. You have to stick it into neutral first. It does shift into low range nice and easily, but you do have a proper low range transfer case with this next generation Amarok. It's always a great thing to see in a 4-wheel drive. And I can't give a full verdict on what this Amarok will be like. It's going to be quite similar to the Ranger naturally. The dimensions are the same, the wheelbase is the same, and give or take a couple of point degrees here and there, things like approach, departure, ramp over angles, they're all mostly quite similar as well. Naturally, one of the vehicles with 17-inch wheels or 18-inch wheels, some all-terrain tyres, will fare better off-road, and the side steps, they're probably going to be the first thing that you're going to trash when you start to push this thing. They're only plastic side steps, they feel a little bit flimsy, and they definitely won't stand up to any abuse in terms of hitting on rocks and that sort of thing. So maybe take those off before you go off-road if you don't want to trash them. But from our experience so far, I can say that the Amarok does feel mostly quite good overall off-road. But our full verdict will come once again when we get one in Australia and really put it through its paces.
Well, first impressions so far are good. This Amarok does feel a little bit different to the Ford Ranger, which I think is really important. We haven't got the full picture yet. We've taken this thing off-road a little bit, but I wouldn't say we've really put it to the test. So I'm keen to see a little bit more what it's like off-road, especially that Americana model with those 18-inch alloy wheels and all-terrain tires. But I like the way it rides, I like the way it steers. It might feel a little bit firm and jittery at times on these 21-inch wheels, but once again, I'd probably be opting for something with a lower diameter wheel for my personal tastes. Now, it's a good first taste, but I'm really looking forward to putting this thing to the test, especially against some key competition when it arrives in Australia in full Australian spec, and that's going to be around April 2023. So stay tuned to Drive.com.au for all those reviews when they come out, and of course, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
Give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and maybe head over and watch our recent dual cab ute mega test and have a think and let us know about where you think this new Amarok would land in that comparison. Would it be the winner, or would the Ford Ranger still take it out? Thank you for watching, and for the full story, head over to Drive.com.au.